Throughout this series so far, I have constantly talked about how the facts presented in the Pokédex aren't exactly accurate a lot of the time. I mean, when you depend on children to fill in your data for you, you're gonna end up with some inconsistencies and things that are just plain wrong. The most famous of these is the fact that my cargo can reach a body temperature of 18,000 degrees Fahrenheit, or 10,000 degrees Celsius, which, would be hotter than the surface of the sun. If that were true, their very existence would be an ecological disaster. Or an even more close to home example would be our ghastly care guide. The whole intro was about how they aren't the spirits of the long dead, they're just creatures whose bodies are partially made of energy. Needless to say, and I'm sure Dan is screaming this at the screen of his phone right now listening to this, the Pokédex needs to be reviewed by actual scientists and all these misconceptions that are labeled as facts corrected. And the reason that I bring this up is because the reputation of our current subject of discussion has been deeply affected by false information in the Pokédex. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how you would raise and care for different Pokemon species in your own home. Today, we'll be talking about the bone Pokemon Cubone and its evolution Marowak. Cubone is a small, bipedal, reptilian Pokemon, standing just over 1 foot tall, or 0.4 meters, and weighing an average of 14.3 pounds, or 6.5 kilograms. It has a tan body with 2 arms and 2 legs, along with a short tail. Its belly is also a lighter cream color than the rest of its body. Now, let's address the Cufant in the room. It's not the skull of its mother that Cubone wears. That's not even realistically possible for the species to continue. If it takes 2 Marowak to make a Cubone, and the mother has to pass on every single time, then you would only get 1 Cubone out of the mating of 2 Marowak. And if that one baby is a male, then that genetic line ends if it doesn't find another female. Numbers-wise, they would be extinct within maybe a dozen generations, if not less. The whole rumor thing about Cubone wearing the skull of its mother is a freak convergence of the facts that when the first Kanto Pokédex was being written, we didn't understand how Pokemon breeding worked yet. And Cubone, by nature, are very solitary, even at a young age. And the fact that their cry and the sounds they make just so happen to sound a lot like the sad sounds humans make, well, they kind of combined into the fact that its mother's died. Instead, the skull on Cubone's head is actually its own bones. Cubone have osteoderms, or bony plates, that cover the majority of its face as a defense mechanism. The only true bone that Cubone carries around with it are the clubs that the line is known for. And it just finds those out in the wild. It's not from the body of its mother. At least it's not necessarily from the body of its mother. I'm sure there's some instances where it unfortunately was, but that's the exception, not the rule. Speaking of Marowak, when Cubone evolves, it does get bigger, now standing 3 feet 3 inches tall, or 1 meter, and weighs 99.2 pounds, or 45 kilograms on average. It keeps the same general body plan as Cubone, with the bipedal reptilian body that's a mixture of tan and cream. The osteoderms on its head now grow and harden together, forming what seems to be a solid helmet of bone around its head. It also now has claws on each of its limbs, which it uses in the place of toes and thumbs. Oh, and I should say that this is the mainland Marowak that we're talking about right now. As with all the other regional variants that we've touched on, I'll cover the Alolan version of this Pokemon when we get to the Alolan Pokédex, especially this one as it's a completely different type combination and behaves very different from its mainland counterpart. But talking about the mainland version of the Pokemon, there isn't too much physically different between the two forms, though there is plenty that is different between them mentally. If that interests you, or you're just surprised by the fact that it's not wearing the bones of its deceased family, then please continue listening. and you might just find out that these Pokemon are the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. The thing about the enclosure for these Pokemon is that they are often found in mountainous or rocky environments like caves. But, as far as I can tell, that's less for a biological or ecological reason, and more because those environments offer something these Pokemon want. For Cubone, it likes those places because those are where it can find the most solitude, as these Pokemon dislike a lot of social interaction with other Pokemon or people. Marowak, however, likes the mountains and rocky environments because they provide a challenge to survive in. It's almost like Marowak tends to have the same mindset that a lot of fighting-type Pokemon have. But aside from those reasons, there really isn't a specific need to have these guys in a fully mountainous or rocky environment. That's not to say that we aren't going to make accommodations for them, we certainly are. It's just that we won't be doing what we did for the Charizard line and terraforming the entire enclosure to accommodate them. Instead, what we're going to be making is something more along the lines of the Geodude enclosure, keeping them in your backyard with a few elements that'll make them feel more at home. For example, shelter will be a big thing for them. As ground types, they aren't going to be a big fan of rain or snow, or the cold in general, so you'll need to provide them with a warmer area that they can use to escape the elements. To this end, you have a few options. One is that you can have a fake cave installed somewhere in their enclosure. This has the benefit of being the most natural option for these guys, as it's what they would use in the wild. If you do this, be sure that the opening is large enough to accommodate a fully grown Marowak standing up. As well, you should have the cave turning a few feet inside so that it forms almost an uppercase L shape. This will not only act as another layer of protection from any harsh weather, but the turn will also help to keep the heat in slightly. The only downside to this form of shelter is that it can be hard to heat with the larger opening, and getting in there to clean it can be a real pain, especially in winter when this Pokemon is spending most of their time in there. Your other option, one that I think would be a better idea personally, is to use something along the lines of a shed or a pre-built Pokemon house. While it isn't close to their natural environment as the false cave will be, it will be easier for you to heat if you have a cold season where you live, and it'll be much easier for you to clean. Not to mention that you can decorate it and add in certain features that you wouldn't be able to do with the cave, like install windows and the such. If you do go with this method, then you'll be looking at something about 15 feet, 4.5 meters, on all sides for a Cubone, or 25 feet, 7.5 meters, on all sides for a Marowak. You'll also have to install a Pokemon door somewhere in the building, as it won't be able to use the human door that'll be there for you to use. As for the rest of the enclosure, you can really just use your own grass yard for this, so long as you keep the grass cut low. Since they tend to grow up on mountainsides or in caves, the most vegetation that they get are mosses or that tough, squat crabgrass that grows in those rocky, hard areas. If you let your yard get too tall and wild, then they're not going to be happy with it and will start to spend more and more of their time inside their shelter until you cut it. Though, one thing that you will have to have are some large rocks or boulders scattered throughout the enclosure for different reasons. Not only will climbing up and down these rocks help to simulate their natural environment and even out their muscular development, but each evolution also has its own reasons for needing a couple large rocks around. Cubone, despite not being a nocturnal Pokemon, likes to look up at the moon and cry. That's cry as in make a lot of noise, not cry as in I'm sad, there are tears leaking from my eyes. This is one of the many things that perpetuate the myth of these Pokemon being little depressed orphans. Their cries do sound remarkably like crying, so I can understand the initial confusion. But I don't understand how the myth has continued all these years. Anyway, getting back to the rocks, when Cubone cries to the moon, they like to do so from as tall a spot as they can realistically reach, which is where the rocks come in. Cubone will use these rocks as its perch while it does this. Marowak, however, stops the behavior of crying at the moon, and instead uses the rocks to test out its combat abilities with its bone club. You'll often see your Marowak whacking away at these rocks over the course of the day. Just let them have at it. Not only is it good for their physical development, but also for their mental development. As far as we can tell, it allows them to feel confident in their combat abilities, which grants them a certain peace of mind. Also, they've been seen tapping out rhythms on the rocks with their clubs. It's not totally known what their meaning is there, but the dominant theory in the scientific community is that they use it to communicate with other Marowaks across the mountains. So, I guess they're slightly more social than their pre-evolutions, but they still really don't live together, so it's iffy on that. But as you can see, the rocks are very important for Marowak as well. Aside from that, you really just need a way to keep them in their enclosure. A fence might work, especially for a Cubone, but it might be hard-pressed to contain a Marowak, if they really decide they want to test their club abilities on the fence. It might be best for you to get large stone blocks that you can use to build a stone wall around their enclosure. This will definitely be sturdy enough to handle both evolutions, but another positive is that by doing so, you provide your Marowak with another place where they can safely swing their club without you having to worry about them breaking out of their enclosure. As for how big the entire enclosure needs to be, you'll be looking at about 50 feet by 50 feet for a Cubone, which is 15¼ meters, and about double that for Marowak, so 100 feet on all sides or 30½ meters. Lastly, there aren't that many Pokemon that you could house with these guys. Cubone and Marowak are inherently solitary Pokemon, and Marowak even is slightly territorial towards others. There are, of course, certain types that you should avoid, like water or ice types. Grass types could also be a problem, but for that you'll have to use your own discretion. Some of them can be good companions for the Cubone line, but there are also some that can be rather aggressive. I suppose that other mountain biome Pokemon might be able to work with them, like the Geodude line, but that's more I'm okay existing in the same space as you, instead of really living together and getting along. Plus, Cubone might not be fast enough to get out of their way if they start rolling around. In reality, your best bet is just keep your Pokemon in its own enclosure, or make the enclosure large enough that your Cubone evolution won't have to really interact with much of its roommates. I should make a special mention of the Vullaby line here while I'm doing this. If, for some reason, you decide to house any of the two evolutionary lines together, you're gonna have a problem. Mandibuzz prey on Cubone in the wild pretty heavily, to the point where Marowak have an especial grudge against them. Putting any of these natural enemies together in one enclosure is just going to lead to one of your Pokemon getting hurt pretty seriously, or worse. Make sure you never put the Vullaby line and the Cubone line together for their safety and possibly yours. Availability. The Cubone line appears very infrequently in the wild. I'm assuming because of the need for a more mountainous habitat and the fact that they're such a solitary species. I mean, if you spend the majority of your life alone, then your population isn't really going to explode very easily now, is it? This leads to them showing up in small, isolated pockets, like in the Glittering Cave in Kalos. Even in Kanto, the place where these Pokemon are most well known, they only show up in 4 separate places: Rock Tunnel, Victory Road, Cerulean Cave, and the Zavalt Canyon on Seven Island in the Sevi Islands, which isn't an area of the world that we mention very often in these guides. They used to appear in the Pokemon Tower in Lavender Town as well, which does make sense. The place was very dark and somber, and the only people that regularly visited the area were the caretakers. It was almost like a cave system in and of itself, and with it being so close to Rock Tunnel, it makes sense that the Cubone line would settle there, despite the Ghost-type Pokemon inhabiting it. Ever since it was changed to the Kanto Radio Tower, though, they no longer show up there. I'm assuming they simply relocated them north to the Rock Tunnel. Outside of Kanto, they also show up in the Warm-Up Tunnel on the Isle of Armor in Galar, and of course in the Wayla Volcano Park in Alola, though you'll only find a lowland Marowak there instead of mainland Marowak. There are also scattered reports of people seeing them appear on Route 203 here in Sinnoh, but try as I might, I couldn't find any corroborating evidence of that aside from local anecdotes of how their populations explode every now and then, so that might be taken with a grain of salt. There also used to be a population in Unova on Route 15, that's got more evidence than the Sinnoh population does, but they haven't been spotted around there in a while, so I'm afraid that population may have died out or moved on. Unfortunately, the Hoenn and Paldea regions don't have any wild populations of these guys at all. I never really thought about it until I started doing these guides, but the Hoenn region really doesn't have a lot of Cantonian Pokemon in it. Weird. Though they may be secluded to specific places around the map, if you can get to those spots, you shouldn't have any issues finding one. Despite their solitary nature, they can be fairly common to find as long as you're willing to go cave diving or mountain climbing. The breeding community is one area where the rumors about Cubone's mother and the skull it's wearing have really hurt it. After all, who wants to raise a Pokemon that's going to die in childbirth? And then, if you get a male baby, then your breeding system just hits a dead end. So, for the longest time, there wasn't anyone who was raising or selling anything but wild-caught Cubone. There's even an old saying in the breeding community that when someone's doing something pointless, they're raising Cubones, because it was thought that there was just no point to it. Thankfully, things have changed since then. Once people actually thought about it for a second, and some scientists actually studied the species a bit more, we learned that the whole thing about the mother's skull was wrong. Once people actually sat down and thought about it for a second, and some scientists actually studied the species a bit more, we learned that the whole thing about the mother's skull was wrong, and people actually began raising and selling them. These days, they still aren't that common in the breeding circuit, mostly thanks to the old ideas that are still hanging around, but also because of the amount of space that having a colony of Cubone and Marowak need. If you are really interested, you should be able to find someone that's breeding them. You'll just have to put in the work to find them. I'll discuss the issues with pricing in the breeding scene later on in the cost section though. Catchability. Once you find these Pokemon, the catching experience is really going to depend on which evolution you're hunting down. Cubone will be an easier catch, but a more slippery one, as they're going to run from you as soon as they think of you as a threat. Marowak, though, they're going to put up much more of a fight to defend themselves. Of course, you should bring a Pokemon with you no matter what you're doing, but if you are specifically hunting for Marowak, then you should be sure to bring a strong water, ice, or grass type with you to defend yourself. As well, since you'll be spelunking a cave system or climbing up a mountain to get to them, be sure to pack accordingly. Camping gear, lights, batteries for things like your phone and your flashlights, and be sure to tell at least one person where you're going and when to expect you back. There are a lot more dangerous Pokemon out there than the Cubone line, and you should always prepare to meet one of them. No Pokemon is worth going missing in the mountains and becoming a statistic. Anyway, changing from those darker thoughts, if you do get the chance to throw a ball at the Pokemon, then you could use either a Pokeball or a Great Ball for Cubone, and I would certainly recommend using an Ultra Ball for Marowak. Care. Before we get into anything else, we should take a look at how you're going to be interacting with these Pokemon and how you're going to get through that more solitary nature. Let's just start with the fact that these Pokemon are rarely, if ever, going to be the ones that are really in your face or running up to meet you. Think of these Pokemon as being less like the canine attitude towards people and more like the feline attitude. That very aloof, detached personality that is okay with you being around, but could function just as well without you. Also, this training and bonding experience is going to be harder and much longer with a Marowak as opposed to a Cubone. They've been on their own for a much longer time, and are now used to not having anything or anyone else around them. Not to mention that they are much more likely to take a swing at anything that bothers them with that bone club than their pre-evolution is. If you do end up getting the later evolution over the earlier evolution, then always take that into account. And I will say that bonding and becoming friends with a Cubone means that when they evolve into a Marowak, they'll be a lot friendlier to you from the jump, which is a bonus point to having a Pokemon through both forms. The first step on the path to getting through that tough exterior is food. As we've done with many guides before this, we're going to be using food to help make the first inroads on bonding. Initially, we're going to be just bringing food out to them. Don't try to force any interaction at this point. A Cubone is much more likely to never come near the food while you're there, and a Marowak might just take the food and run, or it could try to drive you off from the food, thinking of you as more of a rival. For the beginning here, we are just bringing the food in, making sure that the Pokemon sees you placing the food down, as well as sees you heading out of the enclosure. The point here is to show that you're going to be the one bringing the food into the enclosure, starting that association of you and positive food. After some time, you should see the Pokemon start to come near you when you enter the enclosure, kinda staying back while still approaching, expecting the food. This is where you can move on to the next stage. Granted, this is going to be harder for you if you have a Marowak, especially one that tries to drive you off from the food, but what you want to do next is try to get the Pokemon to take the food with you there and eventually take the food from you. The best way to do this is to start by throwing the food to the Pokemon. Don't do it aggressively, that might be misconstrued as an attack, but try to just gently underhand throw the food towards the Pokemon, or roll it so that it ends up about halfway between the two of you. If the Pokemon doesn't come near or move to take the food that you've given, try to toss it a little closer to the next throw. Eventually, you will reach a point where the Pokemon does move to collect the food. This is going to be your starting distance. From there, you should, day by day, slowly decrease the distance between you and the Pokemon, trying to get the Pokemon to eventually eat from the dish with you nearby. If, at any point, the Pokemon turns and flees, then that's the end of the session. Leave the food where it is and let them get their food. The fleeing could be a result of too much stress and anxiety from approaching you, and trying to force more of it out could end up damaging all the work you've done so far. Eventually, after a lot of work and time, the Pokemon should be able to eat while you're there next to it, and even take food from your hand. At this point, your goal is to be able to touch the Pokemon. When doing this, make sure you're sitting in the Pokemon's line of sight so you don't startle them. Move slowly, and try to gently lay your hand on the Pokemon's shoulder or back. It's going to be wary of you, so keep an eye on them. Marowak might turn and lash out, so if that's what you're working with, then you should be ready to return to its Pokeball at a moment's notice to protect yourself. Cubone is much more likely to run as opposed to fight, and if it does, then just allow it to leave and wait for it to come back looking for the food. If they don't after a half hour, then it will be best for you to just leave and allow them to have the food and try again another day. It's gonna take a long time and a lot of patience on your part, but if you're persistent, then you should eventually get to the point where you're able to pet and touch your Pokemon while they eat. Like I said, they won't ever be your cuddle buddy, and they might just hang out with you by existing in the same space as you, but it's as much bonding as you can expect with these Pokemon. Oh, and as for what food they should be fed, these guys are omnivorous. Living in caves and up on mountains where food can be sparse, they've developed to really eat whatever they can find. What you're going to feed them is going to be a mixture of high-fiber veggies, things like bell peppers, carrots, and other collard greens, and bug Pokemon meat, like Kricketot or Paris. Giving them a variety of these foods with each meal will allow them to have a varied diet and get all the nutrition that they need. As for the amounts, a Cubone will only eat about half a pound of food a day, or a quarter kilogram, split between a morning meal and an evening meal. Marowak, being much bigger than its pre-evolution, will eat about 3 times that, at 1.5 pounds of food a day, or 3/4 of a kilogram. Each meal should be equally split between the meat and the veggies. A special mention should be given that you also want to dust their food with some calcium powder to help keep the bony plates on their face strong and healthy. Speaking of bones, there are a few things that you have to do for these Pokemon in regards to them. One is that you should bathe and clean the faceplates for the Pokemon. This isn't something that is overly important, as your Pokemon will care for itself for the most part, and you won't even be able to try this until the Pokemon is fully comfortable with your presence and with you touching it. Unfortunately, one of the major issues that these Pokemon have in the wild is that if anything gets stuck or caught in the faceplates, or if they get damaged and don't heal properly, then they can be a great place for infection to take root. As soon as you're able to, you want to scrub the bones and try to keep them clean at least once a month. Mind you, thanks to the ground typing of these Pokemon, they aren't the biggest fans of water, so when you scrub the faceplates, you want to do so with a damp washcloth or even a wet toothbrush. Be sure to get into all the crevices and places where things can get stuck. This is especially important for Cubone since their plates aren't solid and together as Marowaks are. The nice part about doing this is that if you do it well and don't stress the Pokemon out with it, then they can even start to enjoy the process, and that always makes your life easier in the long run. The last thing that we should talk about is a small thing, but a very important one. You need to be sure that your Pokemon always has a bone club that they can carry around. This club is important to the mental stability and peace of mind of your Pokemon, like the leek is for Farfetch'd. It's a thing where they don't feel they're safe unless they have it with them. Mind you, when you get a Cubone, whether it be from a breeder or the wild, it should already have one of these. But always keep an eye on it, as the bones get weaker and more brittle as time goes on, and you'll probably have to replace it at least once before they evolve. And you'll certainly have to replace them once they evolve. A bone that Cubone considers good for defense would be way too small for a Marowak, so you'll have to have a replacement ready to go as soon as they evolve. The nice part is that a lot of pet shops and treat stores sell bones like these as treats for Pokemon like the Growlithe line and the Yamper line, meaning you can get a variety of bones pretty easily. Cost. The Pokemon will most likely be in the moderate category for a Cubone or the high category for a Marowak. Like I said earlier, they still aren't that prevalent in the breeding industry, and if you're gonna keep a breeding population of these guys, you have to have a bunch of space for them to spread out from each other. That means that, unfortunately, the extra cost and effort is gonna get passed on to you. Food will be in the moderate category as well. The veggies won't be too bad, especially if you're able to get them frozen. That way, you could just buy the month's supply in bulk, save a bit of money, and thaw out whatever you need for the next day. The insect meat, though, that's where the majority of the expense is going to be. You'll have to order it online, or hopefully you have a local provider, because that's not really something they sell in stores. The enclosure is going to be in the high category to get set up. Thanks to the fact that you need the large stone blocks for the wall, the boulders for decoration, and the shed or false cave, it's going to end up being a hard dent in your wallet. The ease in getting it set up and the simplicity in it, though, will at least make things nice. Conclusion. These guys' reputation really needs to get fixed. Seriously, if they would just fix the stupid Pokedex info for these guys, people would stop thinking that they're wearing their mother's bones, and they would be a lot more common in households around the world. And these guys aren't that bad to care for. Sure, they're a little aloof, but so are a bunch of the feline Pokemon, and you don't see people freaking out about them, despite the fact that many of them evolve into large predators. In reality, if you can look past the rumors and false information, you will find that the Cubone line are simple Pokemon to raise for intermediate trainers. The only reason that I say they won't be good for beginners is the fact that you have to set up the enclosure for them, and the fact that they can be a bit finicky when it comes to bonding. especially Marowak. But if you have that level of skill and are willing to put in the work to get to know these Pokemon, then I fully think that these guys could be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we cover the martial artist Pokemon Tyrogue and its 3 split evolutions, Hitmonlee, Hitmonchan, and Hitmontop. Have a wonderful night, everyone.